Hello, this is Guitars and Music. We talk about guitars, we talk about good music that I like and hopefully you like, especially classic rock, but other things too. And sometimes we review gear. Tonight I wanted to talk about kind of an appalling question in a way. Is Jimi Hendrix overrated? I say it's appalling because he's such an iconic, almost mythic figure. You sort of feel ridiculous even asking that question or even saying it. You almost feel like, well, who am I to even say those words out loud? Is Jimi Hendrix overrated? But, you know, his birthday was recently, and of course, September 17th is the anniversary of his death. And there were a lot of YouTube videos I saw that people, said they never cared much for Hendrix, And I think Eddie Van Halen was recently quoted as saying he always preferred Eric Clapton. So I kind of wanted to give my take on that. I've never been a huge Hendrix fan. I like Jimi Hendrix, obviously, and he's a great guitar player. Let's just get that out of the way. He's one of the most important guitar players in the history of the instrument, obviously, especially the electric guitar, but definitely a great guitar player. So let's just clear the air. I mean, he was a great guitar player, and he was a groundbreaker too. And anybody that plays electric guitar, that likes rock, if you like feedback, sustaining notes, anything like that, electric blues, you're in debt to Jimi Hendrix. So let's just clear the air on that right away. But I did kind of wanted to say, I've a little bit about it, just almost responding to some other videos that I've seen, and I'll post a link links to some of the videos I'm referring to down below, and that article with Eddie Van Halen, and there are others. But I was never a huge Hendrix fan. I've got about 500 records. I think the only Hendrix album I ever bought was Axis Bold as Love. I have Woodstock. I've picked up over the years Electric Ladyland, and I've got a couple others of the sort of the posthumous Hendrix albums, but I never was one to run out and buy a lot of Hendrix. There, if I had $10, there was usually someone else I wanted to buy over a Hendrix album. But I do like Hendrix. I always used to. I mean, we used to, when I was a kid, we'd sit around and people would put on, we'd hear Voodoo Child, and it was great. So I was raised around a lot of Hendrix. One thing that I will say about Hendrix is you have to sort of ask yourself, when people say they don't like him, a lot of time, first of all, you look at the pop music that was popular when Hendrix died in 1970. The Carpenters. I mean, they're all not everybody liked Hendrix back then either. I mean, Hendrix was a dangerous countercultural figure. Even just a few years ago, they didn't want to put his statue in Seattle because he was associated with the drugs and counterculture. So it wasn't like in 1970, he wasn't like the Beatles or Elvis. He was a dangerous figure, and kind of a cult figure too. The sort of the kids that went to Woodstock liked him, but a big majority of American kids probably, they would hear Purple Haze on the radio or something and maybe like it. But the people that were really Hendrix fans, they were probably a minority of people compared to people who liked, I don't know, just the Monkees, anything like that. Even Hendrix did tour with the Monkees, didn't he? But, there were a lot of kinds of music, and I wouldn't say Hendrix was ever in the mainstream of sort of pop music. So I think that's an important point. But a couple things that I would say about Hendrix, just sort of in retrospect. One, I guess you have to imagine what people would remember of Eric Clapton today if he had died in 1970 right after Cream broke up, or maybe Blind Faith. He was famous then. Clapton and Hendrix were sort of the big two guitar players of the late 60s. Played in some ways kind of similar styles. Clapton lived on into the 70s, and he's done so many things since then. So when you hear Eric Clapton, you hear a catalog of 60-year career of music, And that little window of time that he was in Cream, which is basically the Hendrix period too, was just a little blip on the radar screen of Clapton's life. Well, Hendrix died right after that. So just imagine how people would remember Clapton today if all you remembered about Clapton was him wearing kind of pink pants and having an afro and playing the psychedelic SG. I love Cream, by the way, so I'm not cutting down Cream, but just think of the fuller range of music that Clapton's done since then. And I sort of feel like Hendrix didn't get a chance to do that. So in some ways, it just shows the tragedy of his young death at 27, where he never got a chance to develop. And there are a couple areas I'd like to mention that I think were areas that maybe he would have developed more, and he kind of never was able to get out of that late 60s. You know, the late 60s is kind of fun. I like it too. I love the pop music of the late 60s, actually, but a lot of that hard rock, it's almost like a Halloween costume party now, you know. I mean, people dress up like hippies like that for Halloween. It's almost a joke, you know. And, you know, Hey Man, and, you know, all that kind of stuff, and you know, but it was serious back then. Well, Hendrix never lived to sort of season out of that. But a couple things musically that I think that do show he never had the chance to develop. One is songwriting. You know, no matter how good you are on guitar, you have to have songs. Now, when you have a great guitar player like that, their guitar is first and foremost. I think that's probably, you know, I'm sure Eric Clapton would say that. A lot of guitar players would say that. First, their guitar player. But you still have to have good songs. Now, a lot of times, bands with the, you know, if you have a really guitar-oriented band, you have a really major guitar player, and the focus is on the solos and the guitar. Sometimes, if you're not careful, the songs become sort of an afterthought. They're almost just a vehicle to play the guitar to, you know. I heard Paul McCartney say once, Jimi Hendrix, when Sgt. Pepper came out, Jimi Hendrix like learned the song overnight, so the album had been out like 48 hours, and Hendrix opened with Sgt. Pepper. But he really just sang like 20 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper told the band to play, going in and out of style, and he's been guaranteed to raise a smile. And then he sang about 4 lines and then just went off into this massive 20-minute long freeform solo, and that was his version of Sgt. Pepper's. But you think about songwriting is really important. Now, the Beatles had great songs. You know, who are great songwriters? Well, obviously the Beatles, but even, you know, Burt Bacharach, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Irving Berlin, Stephen Foster, those are like just pure great songwriters. But, you know, even bands like the Stones that were kind of jam bands or something, they had great songs. I mean, you listen to Stones, they had great songs, and they, as cool as their music was and their image and everything, it was all based around great songs. They had a catalog of great songs, and Jagger and Richards really became seasoned songwriters. And I sort of feel like Hendrix, you know, he wrote Little Wing's a beautiful song. He wrote, you know, Fire, Foxy Lady, Purple Haze. But again, a lot of times those songs were kind of vehicles for his guitar. And I don't know, would you compare, you know, do you think Foxy Lady or Purple Haze is as good as, you know, like Let It Be or Hey Jude, or I don't know, maybe it is. But, you know, I think if you looked at Hendrix, you know, you would see a guitar player first, and you know, a songwriter somewhere after being a guitar player, and an entertainer and a performer would probably be second after a guitar player. So songwriting wasn't, you know, I don't think that was the emphasis. The emphasis was on his guitar. And you know, at the end of the day, songs are really important. I write songs, and sometimes I just do them really simply, and they feel kind of naked. You're almost embarrassed to play them. But you know, a good song is a melody and everything, and there's a craft to songwriting. So I like Hendrix songwriting, but you know, I think you know, if you look at the songs themselves, you take away Hendrix, the guitarist, Hendrix, the figure, and you look at the songs themselves, they might not stand up as well as, you know, if you take Beatles songs, you take the Beatles away, you've still got these great songs that'll probably be around in 500 years, you know. And I'm not sure that's true of Hendrix songwriting. as much as, you know, I think Little Wing, he wrote some nice songs for sure. Kind of good lyrics, very sensitive. The Wind Cries Mary. Another thing is vocals. You know, I think Hendrix himself always said he wasn't that confident with his vocals. And I think, again, maybe he was probably could, anybody can sing, I guess. If you can play, you can sing, some people would say. But, it probably wasn't the focus. You know, maybe in the studio, I guess he would get really nervous about his vocals. But when he was on stage, he just kind of, you know, again, the guitar was the focus. So if you think about it, if Hendrix had lived, and if he were 78 or 79 years old today, and he'd lived all through the 70s and 80s, he might have hooked up with a really top-notch singer, and sort of had a bigger group of contributors in terms of songwriting. So, which is kind of what happened to Eric Clapton and a lot of other people. So it's hard to, you know, again, you have to point to his death and really how his career was cut short. And what we're left are just, what, 4 albums that he did, and some clips of him playing live, and all the things he could have done, that so many of those artists in the 60s went on to do, you know, develop more vocally, you know, kind of, and he never got to do all that. But the songwriting, you know, I think was kind of a work in progress. If you compare it just as a song, not Hendrix's performance, not listen to his solo in Purple Haze, but if you just strip that song away and then compare it to, you know, what we would regard as great songs, you know, I don't know, Bee Gees, and the rock songs too. You know, Pete Townshend's a great songwriter. I mean, he's a freaking great songwriter, you know. And I don't know if Hendrix songs rise to that level. I don't know. You tell me. But when I think of great songwriters, I think of people like Pete Townshend, Paul McCartney, you know. The other thing is Hendrix played in a power trio, and I guess this is all part of the same thing. He played in a power trio most of the time. He did play like in the Isley Brothers and I think Little Richard. That was kind of cool. And that might have been a direction for him had he lived, you know. But he played in a power trio for most of his famous times. And I like power trios. You know, Led Zeppelin's a power trio. The Who was really a power trio. You don't notice it as much on their albums, or like now they play with sort of big side guys. But if you listen to like Live at Leeds, that's a power trio. If you listen to, you know, Robin Trower's a power trio. But the power trio is a certain kind of format. It's a hard rock format. It's a spare format. And the production values are almost kind of inherently limited in a power format. It's very cool. I think a power format trio is a great format. It's almost like a little jazz trio or something. There's a sort of purity about it. But in terms of commercial music, which is what a lot of people expect to hear when they listen to the radio, power trio is so pared back, and you know, it's great for rock and roll. There's a reason you don't see that many of them, particularly now. You know, but I think, like I said, I think a power trio often features really good musicianship, which was a Hendrix had. You know, like that's a format. If you get a couple good people, 3 good people in a power trio, they're sort of, and they don't have other people to worry about. They can just kind of are liberated to push the boundaries of their instruments respectively, yet at the same time they don't have a piano player, they don't have background vocals, they don't have another guitar player, horn section. All that stuff's great. And you know something, again, to make the Eric Clapton comparison, Clapton would end up having a lot of that in his music in the 70s and 80s. You know, it was a lot bigger sound. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that, you know. It's good to have pianos and organs and a second guitar and background vocals. It adds so much. The power trio, it's a little pared down format, and that's really what Hendrix had. You know, I think on his studio albums maybe there was a little bit of overdubbing, but really he was a power trio player, and that's because, you know, only a really good guitarist can do that. By the way. You know, you have to be a really good guitarist to hold your end up in a power trio. And you can't just, and you've got to know kind of how to work in a trio format. It's different than playing with a 4-piece or something. But I do think the power trio thing, so I think a lot of younger people, when they hear it, they might not relate to it. You know, I sort of think, because music today, so if you're like our age, I'm talking about people my age and older, and I was only a kid when Hendrix died. I didn't really know who he was when he died, but I think a lot of people my age and older, when we hear Hendrix, we hear all the context of the 60s and everything, but younger people that don't have all that kind of baggage that goes along with that time period, they didn't grow up with it, they might just hear, you know, a power trio playing songs that, you know, maybe look at all the how juiced up a lot of music is now. And maybe Hendrix doesn't really, if you're like 22 years old and you're used to hearing a lot of the music today and you listen to Hendrix, it's almost like historic music, you know, compared to the way things are done now. And I think that also goes to production values, you know. Hendrix recording between like 1967 and 1973, recording took leaps and bounds. You listen to Quadrophenia by The Who, which came out in 73, and then listen to a Who album in around 66. The Quadrophenia has just it's starting to get that full kind of FM stereo receiver sound, you know, that everybody loves. Those albums in the early 60s were really good, but just as a practical matter, a lot of times you got to turn them up. You know, they weren't recorded on gear that was as nice. And even by about 1970, right when Hendrix died, right exactly when he died, recording technology was just making a boom. And you know, you listen to bands that came out right as he was dying, like Zeppelin and like some of the Stones albums in that period are the same way. They got so much better sounding and so much more produced than early Stones. As much as I love the early Stones, but right when Hendrix died, production values in recording and I think arranging, engineering, all that stuff, but production values of the whole musical scene were just sort of exponentially progressing. And he died right when that was happening. Can you imagine what kind of album he would have made had he lived to 1973? Maybe had a couple other people in the band, maybe a few other songwriters, another guitar player to play with. It's unbelievable. You know, Clapton was in Cream, but then he went to Derek and the Dominoes, and he ended up with a solo career, and he had a bigger band, and he started doing a lot of other interesting things, and I think that made him a better player. He kind of branched out. You know, maybe Hendrix would have gone, there was a lot of cool, you know, like Curtis Mayfield. I could see him doing some of that Isaac Hayes type stuff, you know, or just playing in a, you know, like a really good rock and roll band. But if he had lived through the 70s, if he were a figure of the 70s, we would just think of him so differently, because just think of the difference between music in the 60s and music in the 70s. They're kind of connected. A lot of times it's just the same guys plus 5 or 10 years of growth. But the music in the 70s was really great, you know. Music was great in the 60s, but the production in a lot of 70s music, like you go from Jefferson Airplane in 68 to Jefferson Starship. It's not necessarily a better band, but that Red Octopus is such a well-produced album. Hendrix never got to do that, you know. So the final thing I would say is that the scene, you know, I think, I guess in the 60s, if they say if you remember it, you weren't there. But also, you kind of had to be there. And I think a lot of younger people, like some of these people on YouTube that say they don't really get Hendrix or whatever, they might not relate to the 60s, you know. We've had 30 years of the war on drugs, and, you know, things are much more institutional now. It's kind of hard to imagine a guy like Hendrix being so famous today, in a way. In a main, you know, they didn't even want to put his statue up in Seattle a few years ago. They finally did, I think, when it was horribly defaced. You know, you should never deface art, but his statue was defaced last summer. But I remember when they were putting that up, they didn't even want to put that up because a lot of the people said we can't honor Jimi Hendrix. He died of a drug overdose. Don't kid yourself. People don't talk about it that much because we tend to emphasize the tragedy of his death, the greatness of his legacy, but the fact that he died of a drug overdose and all that kind of baggage. A lot of people just don't relate to that, especially a lot of younger people, I don't think, It's not that they sit around and judge him, oh, what a loser. Some might, but I just think there's a whole scene that Hendrix came out of. And if you kind of get that scene, you can look at him playing at Woodstock and you feel like you're there. And someone that doesn't understand that cultural context, it's just like looking at a foreign country or something. They don't really get it, or if they do get it, they're kind of seeing it as almost a historical artifact from another place in time, which it really is now. That was a long time ago, Woodstock. The final thing I wanted to say is, in the 90s, Hendrix's family copyrighted his image, and I don't think that helps Hendrix to have family members. I think his father, I guess you can kind of understand, but he kind of became a corporation, and they sell, Hendrix pedals, Hendrix t-shirts. He kind of became a trademark. When Hendrix died, he had $38,000 in the bank. That's 1970 money, but still, that's not a lot. But he's a classic example of somebody became worth a lot more dead than alive. And sort of his family members copyrighted and, licensed all his stuff in the 90s. And so now you've got Hendrix signature guitars, Hendrix pedals. They make Hendrix movies, which are kind of tied in with, the corporation that runs Jimi Hendrix. And I think anytime you have people exploiting the brand, it sort of hurts the brand. I think that's true in higher education. I think it's true in anything. When you have people that are interested in the brand but not what made the brand, they ruin it. And when you have these kind of Jimi Hendrix pedals and Jimi Hendrix ties, and it's all sort of trademarked merch, I think that hurts Hendrix. When he played at Woodstock, they didn't sell a single t-shirt. Nothing. And there's nothing wrong with making money. I'm not begrudging anybody that, but the man's been dead for 50 years, and he belongs to the world. So do I think Hendrix is overrated? No, I don't. I think there are a lot of great. I think people have learned. There's some amazing guitar players now, but I don't think Hendrix is overrated. I think he's awesome. I think some of those things I mentioned are maybe things that we don't always think of because we have the myth of Jimi Hendrix, and it's almost blasphemous to say anything. But if you just look at him as a songwriter, as a singer, as the production quality on those albums compared to like maybe an album that would have been done in 1975. You can maybe see why someone who's 22 is not as impressed as you are if you're 65 years old. And again, it all goes to the tragedy of his death. What a sad tragedy. And just all the things he could have done. I just think of how great, I love music of the 70s. Because music of the 70s a lot of times is people that were, in the 60s when they were teenagers and in their early 20s, and in the 70s they're in their late teens and early 30s, and you just learn more. So there was such great music in the 70s. Hendrix never got to do that. We're sad. But he's not overrated. He's a guitar player first. And if he, I think, been in a bigger picture with more contributions from songwriters, maybe get a lead singer up there, with the golden set of pipes, keyboard player, a little more time practicing, a little less time jamming, I guess. But no, he's not overrated. But he is of his time, and he died too young. Thank you. God bless you. Good night.